Right, so hello, Andrea. Thank you very much for being here. This is Picha Neri from Design for Geeks, and today we're talking to Andrea. I'll have you please pronounce the surname. I bet you get this all the time.
Yes, no problem. Zollner.
Zollner. Okay.
Yeah.
Andrea Zoellner, who is chief content creator at SiteGround, which I'm sure that you all know is one of the biggest WordPress hosts, especially for small to medium business, I would say.
All sorts of
all
companies.
sorts, all sorts. I'm sure you have also very big companies, but anyway, it's a very well known and very well loved host. And Andrea and I met at WordCamp London 2019, and I watched her amazing talk on effective tips for the UX of copy. I am not saying the title correctly, but that was the gist of it. And I was so enthusiastic about that talk. I thought it was absolutely amazing. To me, so it was, contender for best talk of WordCamp London 2019, and we'll go deeper into it. So it would be really nice to hear from you now, how you got to SiteGround, what your background is, and how you became an expert in the UX of copy, which is an endlessly fascinating subject.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on this show. It's really nice to be able to chat with you about UX design and to have the opportunity to talk about content and the importance of good content and good content design in UX. So yeah, my background, I studied journalism. So I began as a writer. I studied journalism in Montreal, where I'm based. And so, in Canada, it's bilingual. So I grew up in French and in English. And I think that definitely has impacted the way that I approach design, because you have to be very careful and you have to be very clear in how you communicate. And you have to make sure that you're thinking about everyone who doesn't have English as their first language. So that's sort of how I approach what I do. And so I worked in writing, and I worked as a journalist, and then I worked in communications for nonprofits and for different companies. And then I just really wanted to work with technology. It was something that I'd always been interested in. And I had the opportunity to work for Automatic, the creators of WordPress.com and Jetpack and WooCommerce. And yeah, through there, I got really into it, got really into the WordPress community. I had used WordPress, building websites for my school newspapers and for my personal portfolios, but hadn't really realized that there was a whole community around it until I really got into it for my career. So that was really fun experience for me. And then through that, I met SiteGround, and I'd heard amazing things about them. And so I've been working with them for a year now.
Fantastic. Yes, the thing about WordPress really is the community. It's so important because Design for Geeks is really tool agnostic. So we always talk about design issues that can be applied and used anywhere. It doesn't really matter. But yes, I am very much into the WordPress community, and I find it amazing. And the WordCamps, which are WordPress conferences, are really brilliant because you can go to a WordCamp and literally not watch one single talk that is actually about WordPress, which is kind of what happened to me this year at WordCamp London. I don't think, maybe I watched one talk that had WordPress in the title. Every other talk that I attended was really quite about, innovation on the web, basically, and how to create a better web together, more or less. So, which is also why I was so taken by your talk, because basically you proved to me that the good principles of the web are cross-disciplinary, and we can all work together towards a better web. Because as I was saying earlier to you, I was finding myself like nodding furiously, because also here at Design for Geeks, I've been talking about UX for quite a bit, because Design for Geeks is really aimed at all those people who find themselves designing on the web but don't have necessarily formal design training. And UX is something that comes up all the time, and a lot of people know that they should use a UX process, but they're not quite clear about what it means. And that's why I've been doing various UX-based interviews. And also I just created a UX for Everyone free course, which is about exactly that. Just saying, look, the UX process is actually much simpler than you think. It may sound like a fancy term, but it's really, really easy, in fact, to give, well, not that easy, but anyway, anyone can give good UX to their users. And the great thing about the copy, the UX of copy, is that in one of the interviews that I did recently with Dicky Birds, which is just a WordPress agency that are using the UX process more and more. And they're involved at sort of high level with Nissan, for instance, Nissan, the car makers. And we were saying with them how, I asked them, what would you say is the most important element to get right in UX? And they said, it's copy. 100% is copy, to the point where they now refuse to build, for instance, a website that has lorem ipsum copy or mock-up images. I don't want to do that anymore either, because really design should be content driven. It shouldn't be the other way around. Anyway, after this long rant, there was one thing in particular that made your talk particularly intriguing for a lot of us, because you mentioned the term microcopy, which I had heard before, but you explained it so well that I'd love it if you could just explain again what you mean by microcopy.
So microcopy is all the little bits of text that are in a user interface or on a website. So that could be anything from any of your buttons that you have that have labels. It could be your menu. It could be little help text that pops up. So generally, when you think of your website content, you think of big paragraphs of text. But your website is littered with all these little, 1 to 8 word strings that sometimes come built into the template. So that's usually what I refer to when I say microcopy. And the funny thing is, some people have heard microcopy but don't know what it means. And other people have been working in microcopy for years without knowing the term that we have for it. So I think a lot of people are using it without knowing.
Yes, they are. But it's so easy to lose track of that, to not think that is important. But it's terribly important, because you were making examples about of things such as error messages that can be terribly unfriendly or incomprehensible even, or absolutely not helpful at all. And that's such an important part of UX, because let's not forget that UX simply means user experience. So what is the experience of the people who visit your website? What happens to them? If they have a bad experience, they're not going to come back fundamentally.
Exactly. And that's really the key, is making sure that your whole website works towards achieving your goals, and that's something that microcopy can be very instrumental in doing.
Yes, and it made me look at all my websites and the websites that I do for my clients with new eyes and thinking, especially, have I been consistent? Because the issue with, for instance, with error messages or 404 pages is that normally, especially when you're working on a lower budget project or your own project, you don't think about it because it doesn't seem like it's a priority. But really, in an ideal world, it is a priority, because it's what happens when things go wrong that should be a priority, because things will go wrong, won't they?
Absolutely. I mean, you want to set your users up for success, and you want to make sure that your website works really well. So in an ideal situation, they would never see an error message, but it's really hard to predict all the different places that your users are going to go. And it also is hard to predict as your projects evolve, things might break or there might be dead ends. So making sure that you've covered all your bases, it's one more thing to do, but it makes such a big difference. Because you're absolutely correct. If someone has a poor experience on a website, the chances that they can find that information somewhere else are pretty high. So they're going to keep that experience in mind, and they're going to go elsewhere and never come back.
Absolutely. And also, as a designer, I always bang on about the importance of consistency, of visual consistency, and especially in terms of UX. It's simple things like making sure that all the buttons that are interactive have similar, look interactive, that they have features that make them look interactive, and the colors need to be consistent, and especially with typography is a really important part of the consistency. So why not copy? And it's something that a friend of mine pointed out to me recently when she pointed out to me that I was using two different terms to call my courses. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was like, oh, you're so right. This is really inconsistent, and it creates confusion. And it's the last thing that I want to do is create confusion. And I think the consistency bit is particularly important, I find.
Yeah. Consistency in the way that you label things, like your courses, that's a great example. And for large organizations that have multiple audiences and stakeholders, the way that you communicate with your different audiences, they're going to be picking up on these labels and they're going to be identifying with them. So if you start swapping them and switching them around, then they're not going to know which part of the website is for them. Or if you have an e-commerce website, you have a lot more opportunities for microcopy, throughout the checkout process. And so if you refer to your cart and your bag and your checkout, like these are things that you want to make sure people are going towards checking out, going towards giving you money, and are not getting confused along the way.
Absolutely. And also, especially with e-commerce, even more so, because you're literally leaving money on the table if you don't help your customers out with copy as well. And you touched on something else that is absolutely essential, crucial to UX, which is knowing your audience. So that's number one, because that also is going to dictate the tone of voice that you use. And that's something that is crucial to UX. And it's also crucial to branding, and it's also crucial to marketing. So another thing that I always say is that, as I was saying earlier at the very beginning, good practices really, really do overlap. So the know your audience bit is just imperative. Just do it. It's essential for everything. And the tone of voice, as a writer, you can tell me a lot about how important tone of voice is, and language.
Yeah. I mean, that's all, it all feeds into microcopy, and microcopy, I feel, is just the very small manifestation of your tone of voice. And a lot of people think, oh, I have a very small operation, a very small website. I don't need a tone of voice because I am the tone of voice. And that can be true. If you have your own blog, then yes, you are your own voice. But I think it's really helpful to sit down and outline that. Because if you do your homework and you do the hard work up front, it just makes everything so much easier as you move forward. Whether you start getting more advanced in your design skills and you want to try more things, you'll have that tone of voice to fall back on when it's time to make decisions about how you label a page, or how you how you build your checkout process. And if you bring more people on board with your project, which hopefully you grow and you have more resources to grow your team, then you're going to have to onboard those people. And if you have a document that explains how you want to be perceived and how you want to sound, whether you want your website to feel casual and warm, or whether you want it to look professional and feel like impressive, these are different things that you can decide from the get-go based on your audience, not necessarily based on your own feeling, but based on some research and knowing your audience and deciding on what's going to be the most effective for you. So a lot of people think, oh, branding is a logo, but that's not it. Branding is so much more than that, and it includes your tone of voice.
So much more. Funny enough, one of the I am converting into blog post the talk that I gave after I saw you at WordCamp London, which is exactly that. It's called Good Design is Good Marketing, but really it talks about how branding is so much more than a logo, and how design means everything, and how you should be really careful about how you present yourself and all the aspects of it. So yet again, we're there. It all overlaps. And in terms of the tone of voice and documenting it, that's something else that's so important for branding as well, for visual design as well, because you need to make sure that your styles are all defined so that anybody would be able to apply them, and also you are able to remember. Because it happens very often, especially when we're working on our own projects, that you just don't do it because it takes too much time. You just think, well, it's only me, so I'll be able to remember. But the thing is, you don't remember, and then you waste so much time because you have to go back and check what color you made that button that has the same function as the other button, and so on. So for copy as for design, having your design systems, in fact, even better than just guidelines, is essential. It just makes your life so much easier and so much better, really. It's and in fact, the whole notion, I don't know if you've come across the concept of design system, which is basically it's higher level guidelines, much higher level, because it looks at everything as a whole. So it will be about the website, it will be about absolutely everywhere, the brand, any kind of language, any kind of where anything needs to be repeated. And obviously that works really well for a website, because then you can create blocks of contents, blocks of copy, blocks of images with copy and so on. So it's sort of higher level. It goes beyond just guidelines, but it's wonderful because basically you have a huge library of elements that you can pull in. It's what I'm trying to persuade my bigger clients to do, because it's an investment, definitely. But once you have done it, then in these days of page builders, for instance, it's so much easier to build everything. And if you have that for copy as well, then you know that your messaging is going to be consistent all over the place. And that's so important, I think.
Yeah, it really is. And I think a lot of people think that's very intimidating to, they're like, I'm not really an expert designer. I'm just trying to dip my toes in it. But it's actually super applicable, and it's really easy to learn these concepts and to start applying them at a very small level and then grow and build as you go. So I think that's one of the most gratifying things about the talk that I gave at WordCamp London is a lot of people say, well, you showed me how to edit my templates, and I knew I could do this. It just never occurred to me that I, should, and that I should go in and I should make these changes myself because I'm just a user, or I'm just a blogger. But a lot of people can make a big difference on their website with minimum amounts of effort. And then, like you said, it just, once you do that homework and you set yourself up for success, it's so much easier to be consistent and not have to think about it in the future. You can just refer back to the work that you did.
Absolutely. And you just said something that's crucial as well. It's another crucial principle, which is don't make anyone think any more than is necessary. And you said it in the talk as well. And basically it's so that we don't have to think when we have to create something that's repeated, but also if our users get used to our tone of voice, our message and everything, then they don't have to think hard to understand what we're trying to say, even with a simple button or instruction. And that's back to I'm sure that you know the Steve Krug book Don't Make Me Think, which is there was a recent new edition, but it's still as relevant as ever. And even design principles are all basically geared towards making the brain of the visitor, of the viewer, work as little as possible. And that's Gestalt psychology of vision. That's basically it. You could sum it up in saying it describes the way in which the brain tries to work as little as possible. Our brain wants to do that all the time because the more we think, the more energy we burn. So survival demands that we try and burn as little energy as possible. So it was a long-winded way of saying that they don't make them think, don't make your visitors think, should be really a tenet, the main principle for anyone creating any kind of products on the web, really.
Yeah. Don't make them think, and don't give them too many options. Or if you do, help them to know which one's the best one for them. all these things to reduce cognitive effort are things that, are things microcopy can do. So even if you don't have a ton of design skills, like technical skills to do development, some people are like, well, the theme of my website doesn't allow me to do this. But in fact, if you make a couple of text changes, you can make a big difference in how the person who's viewing your website interacts with it. So if a contact form, for example, if you require a lot of different information, you can group those questions together, or you can give them themes. You can also identify which ones are required. You can give examples. All these little text changes can actually help the user get through the sign up form a lot quicker and with a lot more confidence. And anytime that a user has to stop and think, it's also a little source of friction, and friction is what slows them down, makes you lose the momentum, and increases the chance that they'll just abandon halfway through.
Absolutely. And also, in a way, if you're a beginner user, as you were saying, all the people that are saying, I'm just a blogger, surely it would make sense to do the simplest thing rather than more complicated one. And that brings me to the topic of typography, which is a bit of a bugbear for me, because the web is basically 95% of the web is still copy. Even in this day and age of so much video, it really is still 95% copy. And typography is still hugely mistreated. And one common things that you see all the time, I mean, the ubiquitous thing is the centered text, which I have a particular hatred for. I will not go into it right now. But anyway, the other thing that happens a lot is that a typical beginner mistake is to use way too many typefaces and way too many weights and styles. So, which is sometimes difficult for me to understand, because surely the simplest thing should be the easiest thing. So don't do that. Be consistent in that as well. You're going to help people recognize your copy and understand your message better if you make sure that the typography is also as simple as possible. So what I always say is just choose one font that has many weights so that you can differentiate the headings and the hierarchy with the weight rather than using a different font. Although I'm being too harsh, I'm sure, because surely that's obvious to me, but not to people who are not designers. They just quite rightly think, oh, this is a different heading and saying something different, so I should probably use a different font. Well, I'm saying here, don't do that, because be consistent. It's pattern recognition as well. Again, it's Gestalt psychology of vision. Just make it as easy as possible. The brain wants to recognize patterns, so make it easy for the user who's been on your site for a while. So the typography thing is, so that's also why I got so excited when I saw your talk, because I've been thinking for a while that as a segue to the free UX course, which is basically just an introduction, I believe it's a really nice introduction, because it does give you a framework that you can take away and start using. But I was thinking, what would be the next step? What would be the first element that you need to tackle that's part of the UI, but part of the UX as well? So UI is user interface, for if anyone doesn't know. And that's copy, that is copy as well as typography, obviously, because typography is the way that copy is expressed. So it's super important. And of course, then with typography, you can introduce so many design principles that are really, when you look at them, simply common sense. When you learn them, you just go, well, surely they make sense. Aligning everything so that the eye can follow nicely. Surely that makes sense. Spacing things correctly. Surely that makes sense. But obviously, until you don't know until someone explains it to you. So that's why, yet another reason why copy is so essential and really the number one element. Because come to think about it, you could strip everything away from a website and just do it with copy, nothing else. No images, nothing else. And there are, in fact, on the web quite a few purely typographical websites that look amazing. They're brilliant. There's nothing else but copy on them. So there you go. Rest my case and yours. Number one.
I have to echo what you're saying. Because sometimes people think, well, design is just decoration. You know, it's just that extra layer that we're slapping on top of something that we've built. And that's not it, because, you know, I think people that like really fancy fonts, they view it as something to make their website unique, something to make it prettier. But again, it's just personal preference. So if you're designing your website based on a font that you think is pretty, and you're not thinking about how your users are using your website, then you should just write a diary. You shouldn't be posting online. So, you know, really what your website needs to be doing is first communicating properly. And if that means sacrificing a font that is just not that user friendly, or might be slowing down your website. So at SiteGround, we optimize websites. Our websites are super fast. And so when we see clients that are using a ton of heavy fonts and that they're coming from third-party sources, it just weighs down their website and slows it down. So that's another reason to nix the really complicated fonts. So yeah, like you said, just my preference is, you know, stick with one font for legibility and maybe a secondary font for style, but no more than that. And I love the idea of using different weights as well, because if you have lots of information, you know, I tell people break it up, give it a hierarchy, and that's something that different weights can really help do.
Absolutely. And I suggest you don't get me started on how design is not just decoration. It's a slippery slope. I may never shut up. But yes, I completely agree. There's the speed thing, and a very, very, very important issue, which is accessibility, because the legibility and readability of a font are a very, very important element of accessibility, which is a legal requirement. And a lot of us think, oh yeah, who's going to be interested in my small little website? But there will be, and many more people need for your website to be accessible than you think. There's also temporary disabilities, like for instance, when you are in a crowded place and you can't put the phone, a video on, for instance. It's things like that. But anyway, without going too far with that, but with typography, it really is a big element. It's like, for instance, there's a big trend for script fonts that look like handwriting. And they're a real disaster for accessibility. They're really not very legible, again, because pattern recognition, because people who have certain types of learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, really have trouble recognizing certain letter patterns. So if a script has a letter that looks like something else, which happens often, then a lot of people won't be able to read it. And why do that? So just because it's pretty. So that's something else. You should never make any type of design choice based on personal preference, as you were saying. You should always have a solid reason behind it. And when in doubt, just don't do it. I find it hard sometimes because I do like pretty things. So it's really hard, but I have to curb myself often.
Yeah, I was chatting with a designer friend, and we were talking about user testing, and she was making the case that you don't have to have a lot of resources to do user testing. You can apply the principles of user testing even just by asking a friend to look at your website. You don't need to have, it super structured. And so that's something that, if you're designing by yourself, a lot of us wear multiple hats. We're our own content creators, designers, developers, and we might not be great at all of it, but we're working on it and we're getting the work done. And so just having some other opinions come in and having people that have never seen your work before just weigh in on it can be so helpful.
Andrea, once again, you're sort of saying exactly the same thing that I was going to say, because that's my point exactly. There's a whole section in the UX for Everyone course and also in the London talk. Basically, we suffer from proximity blindness, and you don't need a big budget to get someone else to help you with your proximity blindness. So when you're too close to a project all the time, you won't be able to see even blatant issues. And the point that your friend was making, that's exactly what I say all the time, is you literally need to just ask your best friend, your daughter, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, go out to a cafe and literally say to someone who looks friendly, I'll buy you a coffee, can you please use my website and tell me how you feel about it, if you can navigate it, if you understand what you're meant to do, and so on. And it's really not that difficult. And you actually need, sometimes you can get quite a lot of feedback by, with 5 tests. You don't need thousands of them, really. Issues can come up with much less than that, I think. But it's essential. It's an essential part, I think, usability testing, really.
Absolutely.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you, I was wondering, because when we were talking about, well, if you talk about microcopy, obviously it's everywhere, and you suddenly think, oh, my website doesn't have that much content, and then you think, oh my God, there's thousands of little bits of copy that I need to think about. So with the UX process, you would be creating, you would be mapping your user journey, you would be creating, well, site maps, obviously, but also flow charts, documenting the journey that the user makes, and so on. Would you do the same with copy? Can something similar be done with copy?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And there's lots of different ways that you can go about it, but I think the easiest one, the one that requires the fewest resources, is just to open up a spreadsheet and to look at your website and to start going through these flows and seeing, what is my user going to see step after step? And highlighting all the places where microcopy is repeated, and highlighting the different places where it's confusing and ambiguous, and just making notes of all the different places that a user will encounter your microcopy and reviewing it. And that can be a lot of work. So a lot of people say, well, sure, but I have thousands of pages. Where can I start? And so your landing page for me is the homepage that people come onto when they first get onto your website. That for me is the priority, because that's the first impression. And so that often means revising your menu items, because that's what people are going to be looking at to navigate elsewhere in your website. It can be your call to actions, if you have that. If you have footer information that's important, you want to review that. And all the things that you're communicating on your website on the homepage, I think are important to take a look at. And then after that, depending on what the purpose of your website is, if it's selling tickets for a concert, then you want to make sure that the checkout process for that system is optimized. So you want to make sure, 1, people get to that page, and 2, get through that checkout process without any hiccups. And then 3, that their confirmation email that they receive is consistent with the flow that they just went through. So really, the focus for me is 1, the first impression your website gives, and then 2, the main purpose of your website. What is it that you want people to achieve, and is that flow optimized to help them do that?
So again, it completely overlaps with that marketing, really. 100%. Is your message consistent? And yeah, basically it's the same. So in fact, a really interesting thing just happened to me just yesterday, really, because this series of interviews, I used to call them live talks, because I used to live stream them on Facebook and then edit them slightly and upload them to YouTube. And then with a view of also extracting the audio and doing a podcast. But they were always done live first. So there was a Facebook Live and so on. So there were live talks, And then I realized that actually that created a problem for me, because I also, like you, I speak a lot around the world. And I decided that it would be interesting to create a section on the Design for Geeks website where I can embed the videos of the talks, because some people prefer that rather than reading a blog post, so that everybody, and also it's content that I created. So I think it's a good idea to put it up there, and possibly with a transcript when I have it. And then suddenly I had a problem, because it was but those are the talks. When I go around the world and to conferences to talk, those are called talks. So I've just called the interviews live talks, but they're not, they are, but they're more conversations than there are talks. So because I liked the way it looked, and also on the the starting board. It looked nice. I liked the length of live talks. Interviews is much longer. I mean, I was thinking like a designer, just going, oh, that looks better because it's shorter. So, and then I was like, it's wrong. And yesterday, so I found myself having to, first of all, decide on how to call them. And then I just thought, they're interviews, really. It's not even quite a podcast yet. What it is, they're conversations or interviews, really. So that's how I called them. But because I didn't think about it from the beginning, because this is such a typical situation, isn't it? It's my own project, and I sort of develop it organically. I didn't sit down and think about it and map out the strategy for the next 5 years, as you might do with a client. It's growing organically. And then suddenly it's a typical example of microcopy and how suddenly I had a problem because I hadn't thought about it. And what it meant that because I'd created custom post types for the interviews on the website, then I had to go into the whole custom post types, change so many things. It didn't take that long, but it was a little bit stressful in terms of all the tasks that I had to perform. And I thought about you and thought that's exactly what Andrea would say that I should have done and thought about from the beginning. And I'm still, are they live interviews? And I'm like, well, they're not being live streamed anymore, but they pretty much are live in the sense that there's not going to be any editing. There's not going to, extremely minimal editing. So in a way, maybe they're live, but doesn't matter. I can just call them something else. Whereas the talks that I do on stage, they're live and they're talks. So it's like,
it's really tough. And even if you do your homework and you set yourself up for success, these things are going to happen where you have new projects that you have to label, and they have to fit into that series of projects that you're working on, or they have to fit within the structure that you already have pre-established. And I think that's something that, we're pretty flexible because we manage our own websites, right? But when you start working with government organizations and schools and things that have these rigid structures, and then you implement something new, then these conversations get more complex because they kind of have to fit within a pre-established structure. So what you're experiencing, I'm sure a lot of people have or are going to experience at some point with their design. But one thing that I wanted to mention is, you're saying like live talks looks so good, whereas interviews is so much longer and it doesn't fit as well. And that's something that can be a bit of a trap when you want to sound cute and you want to look catchy and you want to have something that seems powerful, and you lose the you lose the sense of the word, or you lose how close it is to the actual definition, then you're not really serving your audience. I think that a lot of the times when people launch these interview series, or they'll do some sort of like really cool project, they'll want to give it a really powerful name like engage or disrupt. But when the person clicks on that, they have no idea what they're looking at. Whereas interviews, they're like, oh, I know exactly what's on that page. So sometimes these are decisions that you have to really think about and make with your user in mind.
Exactly. And I asked for advice in the Facebook group, the Design for Geeks Facebook group. And one of my friends said, don't spend too long on it. It doesn't really matter. And they were absolutely right, because for what you're saying, it absolutely makes complete sense. It doesn't really matter. It's the content that matters. It's the substance that matters. And also, taking imperfect action is always going to be 1,000,000 times better than waiting until you get things perfect. I am a recovering perfectionist. So, I'd much rather have made the mistake than never started doing the interviews for not knowing how to call them, or, you know what I mean? So I think that's much, much better. But if I can ask you, I'm really curious about how you handle microcopy at SiteGround, because SiteGround is a huge website and it's really old as well, isn't it? And I'm sure that it has so many hidden, and there are so many different journeys that the user takes, and you change them as well, because the chat, for instance, because everybody loves the SiteGround chat, and you end up sort of making friends with the customer support people. You're like, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, yeah, nice. It really is a bit like that, even though you have thousands of people, I'm sure, working for you. But it's the way it works, and that's why people love SiteGround, one of the reasons. But for instance, the chat used to be much easier to find, and now it is quite a bit hidden. So do you get involved with that? What's your role as chief content person? Do you just look after like more, bigger content, or do you also do the microcopy for the user journey, which I wouldn't envy you for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of different answers to that. So primarily my role is editing content that we have on our website. I'm thinking more of like our marketing content. So the way that we present our products, the way that we talk about SiteGround, how that is presented at events. So in our brochures and our marketing content that we bring to around the world. Right. So a lot of that is branding messaging and how that is used on our different pages and our different properties. So that can be social media strategy as well. And so my involvement in the microcopy at SiteGround is more of a consultation role. So we have amazing designers and amazing teams of developers and project managers that work on the actual user interface and the different flows that our customers go through. And so my role is more of a consultant role where I'll come in and I'll give my feedback on some of the decisions that we've made and on how we can be more consistent with how our users experience our checkout process, or the help documentation part of our website, versus what I'm working on, which is customer facing at events and on our blog and on social media. So it's sort of bringing those two together is part of my role, but I don't actually get super involved in the design portion of what we do at SiteGround. Because like you said, we're 15 years old. We turned 15 this year. So we have quite a legacy. And but even the fact that considering that we're a big company that's 15 years old, we work really quickly. That's one of the fun things at SiteGround is as we make these decisions, everyone works really quickly to implement changes and to adjust to a new situation, or if there's a new change in technology that comes out, we're really quick to react to it, whether it's adopting new technology that makes websites faster and more secure, or whether it's making changes based on new studies that show how people interact with websites and making our website more user-friendly and more accessible. So there's a lot of things moving, but I'd say that my role is more just making sure that we're speaking the same language.
And one other question that comes to mind is, how many localization does SiteGround have? You must have hundreds. How many? Many.
We actually only operate in, we operate in English, Spanish, and Italian. So our companies are actually, we do customer support in all three of those languages. And then when it comes to, localization in English, I look at the UK, Australian, and US markets. And US, I sort of include Canada in that, even though Canada has a lot of similarities with the UK. So that's sort of part of the English spectrum of localization. But yeah, we operate in 3 languages, and
that's better, because I thought it would be many more for some reason, but that's more manageable. I know, and because years ago I'm Italian and now I live in Spain. So years ago you didn't do Italian, but you've been doing it for a while now, which is really great, because I think you have a lot of customers in Italy. My sister for sure, and a couple of Italian clients that I have. Yeah, okay. So imagine, and then do the changes start from the English version and then get passed on, or are teams completely independent?
They're generally independent in that, if like for our marketing team, for example, we have marketing teams in Spain and we have a marketing person in Italy. So they're the ones who are really on the ground and reading the situation and acting. And sometimes we'll borrow from each other. So if I do something in the English market that's great and useful, they'll borrow it and we'll translate it, and vice versa. Sometimes there's things happening in Spain and Italy that are amazing, and so we borrow them for the English. So it's a bit of give and take, and it's also definitely like structured for each market to be able to operate. on its own.
How many employees? How big is SiteGround? This is sort of personal curiosity. It's
Yeah,
not.
we're around 500 people.
500 people globally.
Globally, yeah. So I work from Canada, and we have other people in Bulgaria, Spain, Italy.
Yeah, so mostly remote, I imagine.
Actually, most people work in an office. I am one of the few remote workers.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you have a very nice home office. Looks lovely. Okay, that's really great. So, is there anything that we haven't touched that you feel like a deep need to mention?
Nothing that we haven't already said, but I just encourage everyone to start looking at their websites more critically and with more empathy, really to think about their users and think about how they're interacting with their website and try and be as accessible and user-friendly as possible.
Yes, and you said once again a key word, which is empathy. UX is all about empathy, but really life should be about empathy in general, but especially on the web. And empathy is often misunderstood in the sense that we think that just by trying to put ourselves in somebody's shoes, we really understand how they're feeling, but we don't until we really actually do. So if you want to really know how someone who's blind feels when your copy is read out to them, then use a web reader and possibly wear a blindfold, because otherwise you won't know how they feel. So make sure that you use empathy in the right way. There's a wonderful talk by Morten Hendrickson at WordCamp Europe 2016 on empathy. And it's actually in the blog post that I recently published on the Design for Geeks website. There's a post on it's the article version of the UX for Everyone talk that I gave at WordCamp London, and it does contain a link to that talk because it was a huge inspiration for me when I was thinking about empathy. So yeah, I think that closing the conversation on empathy is the best thing that we could do. Perfect. So thank you so much, Andrea. I can't thank you enough for coming on to talk to us today. It's been incredibly useful. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Bye-bye from Picha of Design for Geeks. See you soon. Bye.